China has been investing tons of money into Africa's infrastructure, which has drastically helped out many African cities, whether you agree with the purpose or not. But there is another player which has arguably played a bigger role in Africa's modernization, especially over the last 10 years. And it is not a government or a nation like China, it is actually big tech. You see, even though some nations might view Africa as a chance to gain an ally or political influence, many big tech companies have viewed Africa as the next giant consumer market. And these companies know that if you can be the first big player in a market with over 1.3 billion people, then that could potentially turn into hundreds of billions of dollars down the line. And one of the first companies to recognize this was the South Korean company, Samsung. In 2012, only about 6% of people in Africa had smartphones, and Samsung only had about 10% of the market share at the time. But after doubling their African investment and making stripped-down versions of their Galaxy smartphones, they soon became the most valuable phone company on the continent. And recently we have seen many other smartphone companies follow suit, with the likes of Apple, Huawei, Nokia, and other smartphone companies, as they have begun investing larger sums of capital in order to try and grow their share of the smartphone market in Africa. But here's the thing. Even though Samsung is the winner of the smartphone market in Africa for now, the true winner of this race is Huawei. You see, as part of China's plan to build up the infrastructure of Africa, they also ended up building over 70% of Africa's 4G and 5G networks. Meaning that at the end of the day, Huawei may not be the king of the smartphone market, but they are the undisputed champion of the telecom industry. Now, remember earlier how I mentioned that China was planning to invest $60 billion into Africa over the next decade? Well, that number might soon be dwarfed by a few companies from Seattle and Silicon Valley. For example, Amazon is taking its first step into the African market by building a $100 million data center in Cape Town this year. And even though Amazon has yet to open a warehouse in Africa, it is still a sign that Amazon is realizing there is a growing market demand in Africa. Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter and the online banking platform Square, tweeted out his interest in the continent by saying, "Africa will define the future." And he is not wrong. The technology market in Africa is the fastest growing tech market in the world. Just a decade ago, there was virtually no startup tech investing going on within the continent, but this year there is projected to be well over $2 billion worth of investments into startups. And one of the biggest American investors in Africa is Facebook. Not only has Facebook opened up multiple startup incubators in Africa, but they are also trying to compete with the Chinese tech giant Huawei in order to gain some market share in Africa's telecom industry. Facebook announced a plan called Project Simba, where it is trying to build giant data cables around most of Africa in order to become the main supplier of the continent's internet. And this would be a multi-billion-dollar investment from the social media company, which would just add on to the company's growing African telecom infrastructure. For example, Facebook has already laid down more than 770 kilometers of data cables in Uganda and over 750 kilometers of data cables in Nigeria. So it has already proven that it wants to be a serious player in the African telecom space. But arguably the biggest investor in the African tech economy is none other than Google. You see, Google might be the biggest private investor in global infrastructure in the world, as it has invested on average about $17 billion per year just on infrastructure projects for the past 5 years. And one of its biggest undertakings has been a project called Google Aquino. This project is an advanced cable network that will run all the way from Portugal down to South Africa. And these are just a few examples of some big players making big investments into Africa. But there are also a ton of other notable companies getting into the African economy, such as Microsoft, Netflix, IBM, Cisco, and Uber, who are all investing billions of dollars per year combined into the African economy as well. All in all, what we have seen over the past decade is an influx of investment from both American companies and Chinese companies, along with an increase in trade and investments from some national governments, most notably China. All of this has created an economic battleground that is seeing which companies and governments can build up Africa's infrastructure the fastest and dominate the emerging market before its competitors can. And because of these investments, we have seen some rapid modernization of Africa's infrastructure. For example, in the year 2000, only 26% of Africa had access to electricity, the life expectancy was on average about 50 years, only 71% of kids went to school, and only 1% of the population had access to the internet. Meanwhile, today, roughly 45% of the population has access to electricity, the life expectancy has increased to 60 years old, nearly 97% of kids are now going to school, and 40% of the continent now has access to the internet. So things are improving in Africa. But what might be the biggest factor for Africa's economy going into the future might be Africa itself. In 2012, an African e-commerce startup named Jumia launched in 5 African countries. It marketed itself as the Amazon of Africa, and over the next several years, the yearly revenue of Jumia reached over $234 million. The company continued to expand over the next few years before becoming the first African tech company to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. It eventually reached a valuation of several $billions before having some financial and legal troubles, which saw its stock price drop fairly sharply over the past couple years. But other homegrown African companies have stepped up to the plate in the last decade to become near billion-dollar companies. Some examples are Cell C, Promasidor, Interswitch, OPay, and PalmPay. So what should you take from all of this? Well, what we are witnessing before our very eyes is a rapid development of an entire continent. Now, even though it is still a continent with political instability and a relatively poor infrastructure, things seem to be improving quite fast. And one of the most positive signs is that on March 18th, 2018, 54 of Africa's 55 countries signed the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was created with the purpose to make a single market while deepening the economic integration of the entire continent. It is projected that this trade agreement could single-handedly increase trade within Africa by up to 52%. But this is just one step. Africa will still need to do a lot more in the near future if it wants to become a modernized economy. And even though it may lag behind the rest of the developed world for the next little while, it wouldn't be too surprising if we start to see some African countries become powerful economic players on the world stage within the next few decades. So what do you think will happen with the economy of Africa going into the future? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you liked this video, please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more videos from me in the near future.